Now remember that boycott in 1966 when they were protesting the fact that African countries had to compete not just with each other but with Asian and Oceania countries for one World Cup position, one World Cup spot. Well, that has changed now. The boycott paid off somewhat. What do I mean by somewhat? Well, there is now one guaranteed spot for African countries, right? One guaranteed. They're not competing with Asia and Oceania anymore. They just have their one guaranteed spot. And 14 African countries entered the running for the 1970 World Cup, and ultimately Morocco qualified. Guess what? Guess who they played in the last playoff match to make it to the World Cup? They played against Tunisia. And guess what? They were tied again. Remember we spoke about how they had to draw lots earlier? This time, this was decided by virtue of a coin toss. And again, Tunisia lost. They must feel very cheated. Or they might just jinxed by the Moroccans, right? But remember the Moroccans didn't make it to the World Cup last time, even though they made it to the final hurdle against Spain. This time, because there's now a guaranteed African spot, Morocco actually makes it to the World Cup. Crazy, right? But there's another African country that almost made it to the World Cup. And this is Rhodesia. Why is that, Shingi? I hear you asking. I got you. So Rhodesia, remember I just explained that pseudo-apartheid system that they had as a white settler colony in Southern Africa, right? Modern day Zimbabwe. They were expelled from the Confederation of African Football, CAF, for having a white minority government, and so entered through the Asia-Oceania qualifying group. Africa now had its guaranteed spot, but Asia and Oceania still had its own qualifying group, where they had to play Australia and this time they played it in Portuguese Mozambique, right? This is before Mozambique became independent. So they could play there. They were not allowed. There was a boycott against playing matches in Rhodesia because, much like South Africa was being boycotted, a lot of countries are now boycotting Rhodesia as well. Now, the first two matches were drawn, thanks in large part to the excellent Rhodesian goalkeeper, Robin Jordan. And they're playing in Mozambique, right? And the desperate Australians hired a Mozambican Sangoma, right? Sangoma, traditional healer, witch doctor, call him whatever you want, to curse Robin Jordan. In the third match, Jordan was taken off injured after a collision with another player, and Australia went on to win 3-1, the last qualifying stage of the World Cup. They end up refusing to pay the medicine man, right? The Mozambican medicine man, the Sangoma. And he is irate at this. So he curses them. Livid. He curses them. And 2 weeks later, Australia goes on to play Israel in the final qualifier, and they end up losing. Crazy story is they end up not qualifying for the World Cup until the 2006 World Cup. And hear this, a prominent Australian comedian, John Safran, has a series called John Safran versus God or something at the early 2000s, at which he does different sacrilegious things or pseudo-religious things. And one of the things was to go to Mozambique in 2004, where he tries to meet the Sangoma, but the Sangoma has since died, right? The medicine man has since died, but he meets his successors, and apparently the curse is lifted. And Australia qualifies for the World Cup in 2006. Now, I don't know how superstitious or religious you all are, but that is a pretty interesting tidbit. In the meanwhile, Rhodesia's CAF expulsion was soon followed by a FIFA expulsion, and Zimbabwe was eventually readmitted in 1980. Right. So that's a fascinating little tidbit about the qualifiers. But let's talk about how Morocco performed at the first World Cup back. The first time a non-Egyptian team has been to the World Cup. The first time in 36 years an African team has been to the World Cup. So Morocco was placed in this group with West Germany, Peru, and Bulgaria, right? They lost the first match to West Germany 2-1, lost 3-0 to Peru, and drew 1-1 with Bulgaria. So, that draw with Bulgaria became the first ever point that Africa earned at a World Cup. Indeed. So fascinating. So Africa's back at the World Cup. In 1974, 24 African countries, right? This is the first time we've had more than 20 African countries still competing for that one place, entered this grueling qualifying round, and ultimately Zaire, right, now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zaire, who were the African champions at the time, end up qualifying, and they qualified comfortably, and this is important, scoring 18 goals and conceding 5 on their route to qualification. So, for the 1974 World Cup, Zaire is placed in Group 2 alongside Brazil and Scotland and Yugoslavia, right? Those 3 countries. And they play against Scotland, which at the time was a powerhouse, a firebrand team with the likes of Kenny Douglas, right? Dennis Law, this sort of big hitters. And Zaire lost 2-0 to this great team. Incredible, right? This is, it's not a win, but they played very well. In fact, the Scottish centre-half Jim Houghton said after the match, let's face it, we underestimated them. For 15 minutes, I wondered what the hell was going on. Where the devil had this lot come from, playing stuff like that. I wish I'd put on my Scottish accent there, but I don't really know where to start with that. So what am I saying here? Zaire, they give a decent showing against one of the better teams in the world. Their next opponents, however, they played against Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was onto them, right? Yugoslavia was onto them. Before that match had happened, and after the Scottish match, a dispute about match payments broke out among the Zairean players, with many players believing that the officials from their country had taken the money, right? Some of the uglier parts of African football that we're still contending with today. Chaos broke out among the squad, and they were eventually each given 3,000 Deutschmarks by FIFA. FIFA had to come in to bail them out, which convinced them to play, because FIFA, they couldn't risk spoiling their reputation with teams sort of storming out of the World Cup mid-tournament. So, what happened in that game? The Yugoslavia team was not supposed to be better than the Scottish team. And the Scottish team, remember, had beaten Zaire 2-0. So what happens here? Within 20 minutes, Yugoslavia was up 3-0. Then things took a turn for the worse when their first choice goalkeeper, Kazai Mwamba, was replaced by Tubilandu Ndimbi, who was only 5'4", who was a friend of one of the Zaire officials. And the official was in attendance and wanted to see him play. Short dude, right? 5'4" at the World Cup as a reserve goalie. Come on now. I'm not being high-test here, but and the team goes on to lose, not 4-0, not 5-0, but 9-0. Now, Zaire at this point is under the rule of Mobutu Sese Seko, right? One of the worst dictators known to African rule. And I know some other dictators, people debate their legacies, but I think Mobutu is one of those guys that universally nobody likes. So Mobutu was furious here. He had done a whole big thing before they went there to celebrate them, had them over at the royal palace and so forth. He was furious. Such was his anger, Mobutu's anger, that he ordered several of his personal bodyguards to go to Germany, where the World Cup was, and threaten the national team. They did, telling their squad that if they lost by more than 3 goals to reigning world champions Brazil in the last game, they would not be allowed back into the country. So allegedly. So now we come to the second half of the second game, of the final game, sorry, against Brazil, and more and Zaire and Brazil are leading 2-0. Not quite the landslide it was against Yugoslavia, but it's 2-0. And the players are starting to panic, right? They're fearing for their life. They've been told they can't go back home. Now Brazil was lining up around the 75th minute, right? They're lining up for a free kick, and one of the most wildest World Cup moments happens. I'll put it on your screen here, where they're lining up for a free kick. Brazil comes, and a player, Ilunga from the Congo or from Zaire, just steps out of line and boosts the ball when it's supposed to be Brazil's free kick, right? What just happened here? Does this guy Mwepu Ilunga not know the rules? Right? He receives a yellow card for interfering with the free kick. And ultimately, the game ended up 3-0. Now, that thing about Mobutu Sese Seko saying you can't come back unless you concede 3 is disputed. In other places, it says 4, which seems to be true because they ended up being able to come back home. So what happened here? A lot of people immediately believe that this African guy did not know, this Zairean guy did not know the rules, and that's why he kicked the ball, you know. But think about this. 24 African countries tried to had entered the qualification, and they had made it, scoring 18 goals, conceding only 5. They had beaten Morocco, who had been at the last World Cup and fared very well. How would they not know the rules, right? What are we actually saying here when we suggest that this guy Mwepu Ilunga did not know that when it's a free kick, you don't kick it out yourself, right? Clearly, what people did not know was this backstory that I gave you, which tells us that there was some other stuff going on here. He was frustrated. They were nervous. He was trying to stall for time. That's why he kicked the ball. Here's a quote from a publication. I'll put the link in the description. And I quote, "However, Ilunga will always be remembered for the moment in the final group stage match when he sprang out of the defensive wall at a Brazil free kick and booted the ball down the pitch. Universally ridiculed ever since, his apparent rush of blood was actually intended as a protest against the decision of President Joseph Mobutu, or Mobutu Sese Seko, not to pay the players as well as threatening them," right? And I quote him here, "I did that deliberately," Ilunga said in an interview in 2010. "I was aware of the football regulations. I did not have a reason to continue getting injured while those who will benefit financially were sitting on the terraces watching. I know the rules very well, but the referee was quite lenient and only gave me a yellow card," right? So thus Zaire left the World Cup with no points, having conceded 14 goals in their 3 matches. And also this ended sort of like the golden period in which they had been crowned African champions in 1968 and 1974. So this is a very dear point in African history, in African World Cup history to me, because it was one of those things where it was used to placate or to play into the racialized stereotypes of Africans not knowing what's going on even when they are part of the process, when clearly something else was going on here. There's some other African decadence, of course, we can talk about with the officials taking the money and Mobutu Sese Seko's tyranny. But Mwepu Ilunga not knowing the rules is not one of those things. That's got the story of 1974. So, and also in this case, we've seen the 3rd African team qualify and the first one from sub-Saharan Africa. In 1978, even more African teams, 26 this time, tried to qualify for the World Cup. And ultimately, it was Tunisia this time, eliminating Morocco in the first ever penalty shootout in World Cup history. This relationship between Morocco and Tunisia in the qualifiers is the stuff of rom-coms, right? The first time they met up, it ended up being lots drawn. The second time, it was a tossed coin, and Morocco won both those things. And in the first ever World Cup qualifying penalty shootout. They meet again, and Tunisia finally wins. How do you think Tunisia must have felt about that? Man, if only we had had penalty shootouts in those last two times, we would probably have gone to the World Cup anyway. So anyway, Tunisia qualifies. The Carthage Eagles, right? That's their nickname. They go over there, and this time they're playing against West Germany, right? Poland and Mexico. That's the group that they were in. So after Zaire had been humiliated in 1974, people were thinking that, oh, these African teams are soft. You know, people weren't really expecting much from them. Especially this group is pretty solid, right? West Germany, Poland, and Mexico. So they were down once in the 1-0 down to Mexico at halftime when their coach was also Tunisian. Chetali told them that they treated their opponents with too much respect and they could still win the game if they tackled hard and imposed their belief and self-confidence. So coming out of this pep talk, the North Africans, right, to the Carthage Eagles, scored 3 times to win 3-1 against Mexico. They became the first ever African team to win a game at the World Cup. Morocco had been the first one to draw a game, right? Egypt had been the first one to score in the second World Cup in 1934, but this was the first time an African country had ever won a game, and that was against Mexico in 1978. And the scorers on that day, I think they bear mentioning here. Ali Kabi scored the equalizer to make it 1-1. Nejid Gomid grabbed a second in the 80th minute, and Mokhtar Dube scored the third goal, right? So indeed, they ended up losing the next match to Poland 1-0, okay, and drew against West Germany in the last game, a 0-0 game. So only lost one game, but this was not enough to qualify for the second round. However, you can tell here that African pride had been restored. Africa can actually play, right? And Africa had gotten its first win at the Men's World Cup.